Captain Midnight.
It is a rare scripted show in this day and age that makes it all the way to season 6, especially when that scripted show is on Netflix. And yet, Cobra Kai, the Karate Kid sequel series, has managed it with 5 more episodes right around the corner. The show has quietly become one of the crown jewel hits of Netflix's catalog. But unlike most, I didn't watch the first episode of Cobra Kai on Netflix. I watched it at its original home, YouTube. That the series started on YouTube is both probably a little known fact at this point, and maybe YouTube Original's primary lasting legacy. So how did this happen? How did Google's massive video service make a big move into streaming TV only for their efforts to be relegated to a footnote within a decade? I thought it was an interesting question and one worth examining in my first video of 2025. Before we get into it, I want to thank everyone who helped the channel hit 700k subscribers by the end of last year. That was an amazing milestone to hit, and I am genuinely grateful. I'm also really looking forward to writing some of the stuff I have planned for the next 12 months, and I can't wait to show it to you. Anyway, as we dive into YouTube Originals, I want to lay out my bias right up front here. While I will touch on some of the non-scripted stuff that made up the bulk of their programming, especially in the later years, I'm most interested in talking about their scripted shows. I've always been far more into scripted TV than reality shows, and more importantly, I'm continually fascinated by where scripted shows fall in today's media landscape. As someone who has been talking about Hollywood film and television for years online, I can't tell you how many comments I've read that are in the vein of, "I barely watch old media anymore. YouTube and TikTok are way better." That's all well and good, and I understand the sentiment, but one question always goes through my head. What about fiction? I'm well aware that not everyone feels this way, but fiction is what interests me most in art and entertainment. And while I don't want to discount all the great stories created primarily online over the years, it's also just clearly the case that it has the most difficult time crossing over from traditional media into new media, as the large budgets, big crews, skill, and craftsmanship it all takes is pretty different than just like replacing a TV talk show with the podcast one. YouTube Originals fascinate me because they seem like the platform's most notable attempt at bridging that gap. But the reality TV style stuff is definitely worth talking about too, because I think it may have given us the best indication of what YouTube itself wanted its platform to look like in the mid to late 2010s. Instead of going into one of the heavily marketed shows like Scaring PewDiePie, I think a great show to look at, and one that's emblematic of so many of YouTube Originals' failures, is pretty little known: Origin. I'd be surprised if you'd heard of it, but it was a fairly ambitious sci-fi show from Lost producer Jeff Pinkner and starred Tom Felton of Draco Malfoy fame. It's a decent, if highly derivative space opera that utilizes Lost's flashback structure. Now, I'm more into these type of shows than probably a lot of people are, but I think they managed to do an awful lot with a very small budget here. And I would have welcomed a season 2, especially if they managed to tighten up the pacing. But it wasn't to be. YouTube Originals released Origin in November of 2018. By March 2019, it was canceled. What's worse though, and what I think says a lot about YouTube's lack of commitment to its originals, is that this show is just gone. The channel page still exists, there just isn't a single video on it. And as far as I can tell, they didn't sell it off to another streamer, it just vanished, like it never existed. Now obviously they're not the only ones doing this, and this didn't happen to most YouTube Originals, especially ones from creators on the site. But I think it goes to show how disposable and just non-important YouTube considered its original programming in the grand scheme of things. Especially by 2018, when the writing was kind of on the wall that the experiment was not working. YouTube Premium, then called Red, launched these originals with a lot of fanfare in 2016, and at the time, it was easy to picture their plan working perfectly. Netflix had very successfully ripped audiences away from their cable plans, so why couldn't YouTube get in on the streaming show action? But really, Netflix is probably not the best comparison. I think YouTube Red was looking to be something more like Amazon Prime Video, where the films and TV exist as one of many perks to make a Prime membership more attractive, even if it isn't the core business of Amazon. What that meant in practice for YouTube, though, is that basically all these shows were behind a paywall after the first episode. Now, it is a different thing, but I think what this did was put YouTube originals much more in line with the film and TV that YouTube had already been selling and renting since 2010, and made them feel a lot less like an organic part of the platform. Like, for example, using myself, I own the complete series of Veronica Mars on my personal YouTube account. I bought it probably 10 or so years ago. Love that show. I almost never remember that I own it on YouTube. Like, it exists in this tab I hardly ever visit. It is completely outside the ecosystem of the website as I generally experience it. And I think as a result, it's very easy to take it for granted. Now, maybe originals weren't quite that corridored off, but I do think there's something to that comparison, that originals kind of felt that way too, as something outside of YouTube as most people interact with it. I understand that they really wanted people to sign up for premium, but I think for more of these shows to succeed within the system that they'd already established, they just needed to be free to watch. In the mid-2010s, ad-free subscription services were the hot new thing, and there are some great ones out there, but with the benefit of hindsight and the success of free services like the Roku channel and Tubi, I think ad-supported would have been the way to go here, as YouTube is already so associated with being free to use. It would have been a way for these shows to exist within the contours of what people already liked about the YouTube experience, instead of feeling very separate from it. I'll touch more on the reality shows in a second, but to hone in on the scripted stuff again, I will say I think one huge mistake they made was not trusting well-liked creators or creative teams that existed on their platform already to really make much of this stuff. Rooster Teeth is a prime example. In 2016, they were still, I think, in the prime of RWBY being a big scripted YouTube hit. I can't say RWBY was ever really for me, but I'll always respect the Rooster Teeth team for managing to make a hit animated show on a platform where the algorithm was just not set up to support it. YouTube did distribute their Laser Team movies, the first of which, at least, I believe was crowdfunded. But it always seemed weird to me that they never folded RWBY into YouTube Red and gave the show a bigger budget. Instead, YouTube's algorithm just made it harder and harder for fiction to succeed over the years, to the point where the show eventually just left the platform altogether. So instead of relying on more creators from their own platform for these fiction originals, they really leaned on Hollywood talent. Now this is the safer path, and maybe the correct one, I totally understand it, but I think it made it very hard to connect these shows to anything the average YouTube viewer cared about on the platform. But what I think hurt the scripted shows most is that a lot of them just looked really, really cheap. Now, streaming services were spending tons and tons of money on original programming in the 2010s. And outside of Netflix and maybe HBO, I think it's safe to say that a lot of the time, that just didn't work out for them. So I understand YouTube wanting to play things more cautiously. The thing is though, they still wanted to greenlight these very high concept premises without ever providing the budgets to pull them off. Look at a show like Weird City, which is kind of a less bleak spin on Black Mirror. That landed some notable actors like Michael Cera, and despite it being fairly enjoyable, a lot of these effects look straight out of Phil of the Future. Now, to be honest, I'm fine with this, but I'm a 90s and 2000s syndicated TV sicko who will happily watch New Zealand shot fantasy shows that look like they cost $6. Most people are not me. If they were really trying to compete with the Netflixes of the world, I think they really needed to support more grounded shows where the lower budgets aren't as big of an issue, or pony up some more money to bring these shows up to the standard where they'll really impress a larger audience. YouTube seemed to want big, splashy, scripted genre shows, but they didn't want to pay for them. And the result is often shows that honestly kind of look like YouTube videos that you have to pay extra to see. Then there's the reality TV aspect of it, which was a major part of these originals. I'll be upfront with you here, no offense to my fellow creators, but I have just not seen much of most of these YouTubers, which makes it very hard to judge a lot of these shows. Now, I have nothing against them, but most of the creators I watch are a bit more niche, like the Library Ladder. Shout out to Library Ladder. Not these mega popular ones. Now, I really enjoyed Vsauce's Minefield and the Rocket League episode of Matpat's Game Lab, but by and large, I wouldn't say a lot of these appealed to me. I was really interested to search through what fan communities thought of these shows at the time. It seems like there was kind of a general feeling that these shows, while giving the creators more money to mess around with, sometimes stripped them of their personalities, making them resemble more traditional TV hosts. And I want to stress, most of them I am not familiar with enough to say that for sure, but it is just a recurring complaint that I saw crop up over and over again. There's also the issue that these shows were being made while creators still had their main channels to manage and run. And it's easy to see how that could lead to a lot of burnout and split attention. This 2016 to 2019 era is when creator burnout was a really hot topic being discussed by a lot of YouTubers. And obviously most of them didn't have YouTube Red shows, but for the ones who did, I would not be surprised if that had been a huge contributing factor. Running a television show is really difficult. Doing it as basically a second job, yeah, I could see how that could be rough. In the end, even if these shows garnered a lot of attention at launch, most of them didn't last more than 2 seasons. By 2020, YouTube Originals was winding down. Stuff was still coming out, mostly documentary-style commentary shows. Also these weird videos where like The Simpsons and Bill Gates gave speeches to the class of 2020, but the writing was on the wall. YouTube hopped on the peak TV trend of the 2010s when Netflix was the tech industry golden boy. They were far from the only big company to do this. And that didn't work out for a lot of these big players. Side note, let me know if you'd like to see a video covering the downfall of Facebook's original shows. As that era faded, they hopped on the short video trend instead, leaving YouTube Originals as kind of a relic of the 2010s. An interesting experiment in making more expensive programming for YouTube, including fiction, but one that, despite all the marketing, I don't think they ever truly knew how to integrate with their already existing platform. Anyway, thanks for putting up with that long wait between videos. If you're watching this when it comes out, I should be right in the middle of my big cross-country move, and by next week I hope to settle in and get back on a more regular schedule. We're also making significant progress on the second issue of my comic book series, Binary C. I'll put a link in the description if you'd like to check that out on Amazon. Like 30 Leaves did, who left a 5-star review saying, "One of the best written comics I've read in years, with interesting characters, pirate thrills, and a fascinating mystery. Can't wait for issue 2. Thank you so much for that review, and if you do check it out, I'd love to see some more reviews, really no matter what you thought of it. Thanks again, and I will see you very soon.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.